Is this on? Yes. Thank you, Ravi. Hi, everybody. How are you? Yeah, my name is Bill Reynolds. I'm a journalism professor here. My specialty is feature writing, the review of journalism, magazines, the kind of thing that Rogers sold off to St. Joseph Media a few years ago for a song. So it's kind of ironic. I want to introduce Alexandra Posadzki. Alex, who used to be my student back in 12, maybe? Not so long ago. Even back then, I just want to say, before I give you the formal spiel about Alexandra Posadzki, I want to talk about Alex. Alex was a go-getter from day one in my Master of Journalism feature writing class. She pursued her story diligently and consistently and produced a great piece of work. I had no doubt in my mind that she would be a really great journalist from the get-go. I just want to put that in. Alexandra Posadzki is an award-winning business journalist with the Globe and Mail, Canada's largest national newspaper, where she covers financial and cyber crime. She is also the author of the instant #1 best-selling book, Rogers versus Rogers, The Battle for Control of Canada's Telecom Empire. Copies of that will be available over in the Rogers Center when we have our little soiree after this, if you have any money, any shekels to get rid of. Okay. Her coverage of the country's telecommunications industry, and in particular the conflict at Rogers, won several Canada Best in Business awards from the Society for Advancing Business Editing and Writing. She was featured in a 2022 Netflix documentary called Trust No One, The Hunt for the Crypto King, for her contributions to the Globe's industry-leading coverage of a massive crypto conspiracy Ponzi scheme. There must be more than one of those. She lives in Toronto and is a graduate of the Toronto Metropolitan University's Master of Journalism program. Please welcome Alexandra Posadzki. Do you need that?
There we go. Thanks. Okay, take two. So before we dive into the importance of business narratives, there's something that I need you all to know. It was never my plan or my intention to become a business journalist. Throughout my life, I had a lot of ideas about what I wanted to be when I grew up. Writer, novelist, lawyer. I'm pretty sure at one point I wanted to be a ballerina. But business journalist, it honestly never crossed my mind. I never read the business pages or found business particularly interesting, and my guess is that at least some of you in this room feel the same way. So let me give you a quick recap of the journey that landed me at the Report on Business, covering some of the country's biggest business stories and writing a best-selling business book, a career that I now would not trade for anything. I got my start in journalism actually as an arts reporter for the York University student newspaper, the Excalibur, eventually working my way up to editor-in-chief. My first job at a daily newspaper was writing crime stories from the radio room at the Toronto Star. So for those of you who don't know, this is the room where they have all the police scanners, and you actually just sit there listening to incidents happening and then jump on the phones. I don't think they have the police scanners anymore, but back in my day. After that, I covered Ontario news for the Canadian Press Newswire. I was put on the business desk one summer after returning from a very intense reporting assignment at the scene of a fatal mall collapse in Elliott Lake, Ontario. I thought that I was being punished. My boss at the time, who was fantastic, said, "Welcome to the promised land. You never have to work weekends and you never have to call dead people's relatives." Having spent the past 2 years writing a book, one in which several of the main characters have died, I can tell you that neither part of that statement is true. Those first few months as a business reporter were rough. I had to learn how to read an earnings report and essentially how to speak a totally new language, one riddled with jargons and acronyms that I did not understand. But the more I began to understand the dynamics of business and the economy, the more hooked I became. At CP, where I was eventually hired as a full-time reporter on the business desk, I was entrusted with two of the most important beats in the Canadian economy, banking and real estate. I also got to write about a topic that I personally found fascinating, the fledgling cannabis industry as it was on the cusp of legalization. My high school self was squealing with joy when I landed an exclusive about a branding deal between a Canadian cannabis company and the rapper Snoop Dogg. In mid-2017, after joining the Globe and Mail as a business reporter, I started writing about another emerging industry, crypto. That's how I ended up covering the collapse of Quadriga, which used to be the largest cryptocurrency exchange in Canada. The story was stranger than fiction. The company went into creditor protection after its CEO abruptly died from complications of Crohn's disease while he was on his honeymoon in India. He was apparently the only one with the passwords to the company's Bitcoin wallets, which meant that his death left more than 100,000 users unable to access more than $250 million worth of cryptocurrency. Some people lost their life savings. An army of internet sleuths sprang into action, spawning conspiracy theories that the founder had faked his own death. It didn't help when me and my colleague at the Globe and Mail revealed that Quadriga's other co-founder was a convicted felon who had changed his name not once but twice after serving time in a US prison for laundering money for an online identity theft ring called, I can't make this up, Shadow Crew. The story was so full of crazy twists and turns that it spawned a Netflix documentary called Trust No One: The Hunt for the Crypto King. Most recently, I found myself in the role of telecom reporter while Canada's largest wireless carrier was in the midst of a dramatic power struggle, one that has been compared to HBO's Succession and even contains a disputed butt dial. But I'll come back to that. The point I'm trying to make here is that business stories are not only vital and touch people's lives, they can also be wildly entertaining. Because at their core, business stories are about people and human emotions, ambition, betrayal, greed, sibling rivalry, and the insatiable hunger for power. When I first started covering corporate Canada, I struggled for a long time with feeling like an outsider. I wasn't educated at private schools like Bishop Strawn. I didn't rub elbows with families like the Rogers family. My parents weren't politicians or business leaders. They're immigrants who fled communist Poland in the 1980s. I didn't benefit from inherited wealth or family connections. But eventually, I came to see my status as an outsider as a strength. The business leaders that I write about are not my friends, which makes it easier for me to be critical of them. I'm not fangirling over CEOs or subconsciously trying to protect anyone's reputation. Being an outsider makes it easier to call it how you see it. So let's talk about calling things out. Because broadly speaking, there are two types of business journalism: access journalism and accountability journalism. Access reporting, in a nutshell, is about getting access to powerful people and institutions, gaining inside information about the actions or intentions of powerful actors before they're widely known. A good example of this would be a scoop about a major merger or an acquisition. Company A has struck a deal to acquire Company B for however many billions of dollars. Accountability reporting, on the other hand, involves gathering information not from powerful actors, but about them, essentially holding them accountable. An example of this would be the long-form expose. Dean Starkman, in his book, The Watchdog That Didn't Bark: The Financial Crisis and the Disappearance of Investigative Journalism, writes that access reporting tells readers what powerful actors say, while accountability reporting tells readers what they do. Both types of journalism have their value and their role, but in the digital area, accountability journalism is under threat. Access journalism is fast to produce and generally non-confrontational. After all, powerful people are not going to give you access to them if you're writing critical things about them. Because it's faster to produce, access journalism is a better fit for the demands of the 24/7 digital news cycle. Accountability journalism, on the other hand, is expensive, time-consuming, and enemy-creating. But Starkman argues that protecting it is vital because without access reporting, journalism has no purpose, no center, no point. He argues that it was a shift by the business journalism industry towards access journalism and away from accountability reporting that caused the mainstream financial press to largely miss the biggest US business story in recent history, the subprime mortgage lending crisis that caused the 2007 financial crash. Let's take a step back and talk about the evolution of the business pages. Financial journalism began as a source of market and pricing information for a very niche audience. For instance, Lloyd's List, which was started in London in 1734, began as a source of shipping news and stock and commodities prices for underwriters of shipping insurance. I don't think it gets more niche than that. At the time, the business press was generally geared towards the merchant class. The Globe's report on business was no different when it started. In 1844, Globe founder George Brown packaged together a few stories into a section called Financial Intelligence that was delivered to Toronto's then fledgling financial sector and a small number of wealthy farmers surrounding the city. As the country's economy evolved, so did the Globe's business pages. From stories about farms, fishing, forestry, and mines, to the country's transformation during the post-war industrial boom, which the Globe chronicled with stories about the introduction of computers and advances in telecom. By the 1960s, as Canada's automotive sector boomed, the Report on Business became the forum for business leaders fighting battles to win over public opinion. But it wasn't until much later that the Report on Business started to shake off its reputation for thorough, thoughtful, but dreadfully dull reporting. Reporters used to be sent to the business section if they couldn't hack it covering politics or foreign affairs. But by the 1980s, as Canadian business became dominated by larger-than-life figures that made for exciting storytelling, business reporters became some of the most high-profile and highly paid journalists in the country amid a waging war for talent. It was a rude awakening for corporate Canada, which suddenly found itself having to deal with critical coverage. The change in journalistic tone and focus was not unique to Canada. It followed the evolution of the US business press, which had been gradually moving away from serving as an intra-market news service for the merchant class and more towards the laudable goal of explaining complex topics such as how the economy works or how decisions are made inside corporations to a general audience. The aim of the strategy was not driven by a noble desire to democratize financial information, but rather by something much more pragmatic, the need to increase subscriptions and advertising revenue by appealing to a broader audience. The Wall Street Journal led the charge. The strategy worked. In 1940, circulation at the Journal was stuck in the 30,000s. By 1966, it surpassed 1 million readers. And that success was largely the result of the arrival of accountability journalism to the business pages. At its core, journalism is about holding power to account. And who holds more power in modern society than billionaires and large corporations? That's why I would strongly encourage all of you to pay attention to the business section, even if you don't end up writing for the Report on Business. Business touches all aspects of our lives. What impacts us more than inflation at the grocery store or the red-hot real estate market that makes it so challenging to buy a home? How about the nationwide Rogers outage that took down the entire Rogers network for at least a day in the summer of 2022? There is a whole chapter about that in my book, by the way, where you can learn about how it happened and the extent of its impact, from canceling the weekend concert because the doors to the Rogers Center wouldn't open, to emergency alerts failing to inform people about a tornado and an active shooter. Personal finance stories, meanwhile, help us to make important decisions that can shape the outcome of our lives, such as whether we're able to afford a home or save for retirement. Business stories also make us smarter about the world around us. Raise your hand if you have a cell phone or an internet plan from Rogers. Or if you've been to a Blue Jays, Raptors, or Maple Leafs game. Or how about a concert at the Rogers Center? So basically the whole room. Now, how many of you knew that Rogers recently struck a deal to acquire Bell's stake in Maple Leaf Sports and Entertainment, the company that owns almost all of the city's most valuable sports teams? That's great. You guys read the news. I love it. They already own more than a third of MLSE, but if they successfully acquire Bell's stake, that will give Rogers greater control over decision-making at MLSE, such as how much to spend on player salaries. In Canada, we don't pay enough attention to Canadian business stories, despite the outsized impact they have on our lives. We all know who Elon Musk is, and many of the intimate details of his love life. But how much do we know about Toby Lutke, the CEO of Shopify? Or Edward Rogers, the extraordinarily powerful executive chairman who effectively controls a significant swath of the country's critical infrastructure? That's one of the reasons why I decided to write my book, Rogers versus Rogers. I wanted to document a critical and very dramatic moment in time at a significant and celebrated Canadian institution. For those who don't know, Rogers was founded by a legendary Canadian entrepreneur named Ted Rogers. Ted's story is an inspiring one. Although he came from an affluent family, after all, he attended boarding school at Upper Canada College, Ted overcame a litany of obstacles, from health problems to bullying to the premature death of his own father. He was the OG Canadian entrepreneur, taking on huge financial risk to build what is today a communications behemoth. And he would have been devastated to see the fractious conflict that emerged between his adult children after his death. In 2021, Rogers announced that it had struck a deal to acquire Calgary-based Shaw Communications for $20 billion. It was the deal of Ted's dreams. Many years earlier, he and Shaw founder J.R. Shaw, through two infamous handshake deals, carved Canada into East and West, with Rogers dominating in the East and Shaw in the West. This $20 billion deal was the historic coming together of Canada's two cable families that had forged bonds over decades of friendly rivalry and practical jokes. But while the company was in the midst of trying to consummate that critically important deal, a process that required the approval of not one, but three federal regulators, Edward Rogers single-handedly attempted to fire the company's CEO, Joe Natale, and replace him with its chief financial officer, Tony Staffieri. The move ultimately met opposition from the company's board, including two of Edward's sisters and his very own mother. It was the CFO who was fired instead. The news went off like a grenade on Bay Street late one evening in September, a press release announcing the CFO's departure, effective immediately, in the midst of a major takeover. That press release was the first sign that the public saw that something was amiss at Rogers Communications. No reason was given for the CFO's departure, a clear sign that he had been fired. The news had everyone in Canada's tight-knit business community talking. I started working the phones, and over the course of several days began piecing together what had happened. What I learned shocked me. Tony Staffieri's departure was the result of a power struggle in the highest ranks of Canada's largest wireless carrier, one that had initially aimed to unseat the CEO. Rogers chairman Edward Rogers had lost confidence in Joe and wanted to replace him with Tony. The bulk of the telecom's senior leadership team was also on the chopping block. But Edward's plan started to go awry when Joe learned of it and brought the matter to the board. A faction of independent directors, led by none other than former Ontario Premier David Peterson, as well as Edward's mother and two of his sisters, ultimately voted against the change. They believed that Joe was doing a fine job and that it was the wrong time to replace the CEO, while the company was awaiting not one but three regulatory approvals for its takeover of Shaw. They were worried that an exodus of senior leadership would destabilize the company at a critical time. What followed was one of the most dramatic boardroom and family spats in Canadian corporate history. This is a story that has it all: boardroom backstabbing, sibling rivalry, betrayal, dueling boards, and even a disputed butt dial. And I have to tell you that getting the words butt dial on the front page of the Globe and Mail was one of the crowning moments of my journalistic career thus far. Eventually, Edward struck back by firing the independent directors who had gone against him. He did so not by convening a shareholder meeting, as one would normally do, but through an unusual mechanism, a written shareholder resolution. A quirk in the BC Corporations Act allowed him to do so. Most people don't know this, but Rogers is actually incorporated in British Columbia, even though their headquarters are here in Toronto, something that Edward's father enacted for tax purposes. His sister, Melinda, likened it to rewriting the board's composition with the stroke of a pen. Edward's position as the company's controlling shareholder allowed him to do this. That's because Rogers has what's known as a dual-class share structure. Essentially, they have two classes of shares. The Class A shares come with 25 votes apiece, while the Class B shares, the ones that regular investors hold, carry no votes. And 97.5% of the voting shares are held within an entity called the Rogers Control Trust, which is controlled by the Rogers family. As chair, Edward alone had the ability to vote those shares, ultimately giving him control over a large swath of the country's critical infrastructure. The position came with a duty to consult other family members, who obviously didn't feel that they had been consulted. As chairman, as controlling shareholder, Edward could be removed by a 2/3 vote of the advisory committee, a group that included members of his family as well as longtime family friends, including none other than former Toronto Mayor John Tory. That group of his dad's old buddies, who had all promised Ted that they would guide his son after his death, ultimately sided with Edward. The company's management, however, challenged the legality of replacing the board without a shareholder meeting. They put out a statement claiming that the board remained unchanged. The situation spiraled so out of control that at one point the company ostensibly had dueling boards of directors, and no one could definitively say which was the real board, a situation that one of my sources called Schrodinger's board. I won't spoil all of the details for you. There's a whole book that lays it out for those of you who are interested. Suffice it to say, what drew me and many of the Globe's readers to this story was the raw humanness of it. That and the fact that the CEO allegedly learned that he was about to lose his job through a butt dial, or at least a butt answer, from his very own CFO. It's not just a business story, although it is very much about a business, one that happens to be controlled by a wealthy, prominent family. A family which found itself so torn apart that the chairman's baby sister took to tweeting disparaging things about her brother at strange hours of the night. For instance, that he'd spent a lifetime hiding behind their mother's skirt. It's those kinds of details that bring business stories to life for readers. At the end of the day, it's important to remember that businesses are controlled by people. And those people are also controlled by something, whether it's ambition, a thirst for power, a sibling rivalry, or the need to prove themselves to a parent who always seemed to doubt them. And those very human emotions translate into decisions made around the boardroom that ultimately trickle down to investors and consumers. That's why business stories matter. Good business stories bring readers into the boardrooms where those key decisions are made. They bring to life stories about economic trends, telling us what those new mortgage rules will do to house prices or why the interest rate cut isn't reflected on our credit card bills. They educate us about the issues we need to understand to make important financial decisions. They warn investors about fraudulent companies and the potential dangers lurking in unregulated emerging asset classes like cryptocurrencies. And they hold powerful people such as business leaders and billionaires accountable for their actions in the hopes of making society a little bit more fair. As journalists, I think we can all agree that that's an important goal. Thank you.
We'll give you a second to talk it through with your colleague beside you, and we'll come back in about 2 minutes with an opportunity to ask some
Thanks, Alex. I don't know how we're going to handle the fact that that mic no longer has a...
Oh, there's no battery in it.
Is there power?
Hello?
There is, she has...
Right.
So what we'll do is...
It does seem to be working.
Hello? Yes?
Okay. How did he pull that off?
He snuck in when you weren't looking. Oh, yeah.
So we've taken to doing this thing right in the last couple.
and then we'll get it going. Hi, everybody. Okay, so I have a question I've been dying to ask Alex, so I'm going to go first, and then you guys can continue on. My first question is, you're talking to important, powerful people or family members of powerful people. How did you manage to crack through that wall and get access and get them to talk to you?
It's a great question. Persistence, I know that's kind of a cliche thing to say, but it is really true, is persistence. People say no to you over and over and over and over again until something changes, and then they say yes. And maybe that's now they have some sort of motivation for talking to you. Maybe something in the dynamic has shifted. And then it's like, as soon as you get that one person talking, it sort of opens up a floodgate of people talking, because the more you know, the more you're going into a conversation with a source saying, well, I already know this. Is this true? Because if it's not, you should tell me so that we don't publish it. And that desire that people have to either get their own side of the story out or to correct factual inaccuracies will often be the thing that you can use to convince them to talk to you. So that was a big part of it. And then, you know, there were other inputs into the book as well, right? So there's tons of court documents that had really good information, regulatory filings, all that kind of fun stuff. And then, of course, there had been a few books written about Rogers before the fight, the kind of founding of Rogers' story. And so those were like really, really helpful resources in telling the sort of historical part of the story.
First of all, I just want to say I'm halfway through the book. Great story so far. The question I wanted to sort of ask is, multiple members of my family have worked at Rogers in some way, shape, or form. I sort of wanted to know, how does the impact at the top sort of fall through the rest of the company? Have you noticed, like, so far it seems like Ted is very micromanaging. He wants to take care of literally every aspect of the company, but since that changed, because I haven't gotten all the way through, how do decisions at the top, or like you said, the conflict between the family, how does that play out throughout the rest of the company, all the way down to like even the most entry-level positions, essentially? Or like, do those top-level executive decisions, do you see them being impacted on everyone else within the company?
Yeah, that's a great question. Absolutely, you do see those reflections trickle down. So in a couple of ways, I guess the main way would be culture. So you have the tone, the culture that's set at the top, and that trickles down. So in Rogers, because we had this founder who was so micromanaging, he also really liked to pit people against one another and create competition, because he believed the competition made people perform better. And so there's stories I was told about, for example, two people or two departments would be given the same assignment without knowing, and then he would just like see who does it better. And so when you have that kind of culture within an organization, you're gonna have something develop like a paranoia between people. You're gonna have siloing of information, like people are not sharing information freely because they're paranoid about their job being at stake. In those high-level boardroom meetings, Ted would lose his temper, he would yell at people, right? And then when you have that kind of a culture, everyone's kind of on edge because they're all trying to make Ted happy. And then Ted also had a very, very public health decline. Like, people in the company watched his health decline as he was aging. He did not step down and give the job to his son, Edward, like all of his friends in the cable industry had done. He wanted to keep running the company right up until the end. He postponed his retirement so many times that the board actually just gave up on the whole concept of him ever retiring. And that also really affected, because as much as Ted was this kind of really intense, temperamental person, he was also really magnetic, and people would generally forgive him because he was brilliant and he had this gift of foresight. He could sort of predict technological change before it happened. And so watching his decline was a really painful thing for the company to go through. And then once he was gone, the company had lost this leader that had had his hands in every major decision. And so now people maybe don't know how to make decisions on their own without Ted there. And his son, Edward, felt that nobody could be dad. And so the company went through a series of CEO changes after that, where you had the CEO being replaced every few years or leaving. And with each CEO, they would bring in their own team of leaders to change their priorities slightly, right? So if you were a lower level employee, you were working on a project where like modernizing the call centers, okay, great. And then all of a sudden, the CEO changes, and then there's a cascading effect, and now there's a new person in charge of the customer service division, and they've decided they don't like this call center modernization project. So now this thing that you spent all this time working on is being canceled, or it's in limbo, and you don't know what's happening with it. Executives are making decisions about things like where to allocate resources, and that trickles down to people on the front lines, because they're deciding how many staff to put in that Rogers store. They're deciding how many staff to put in that call center. They're deciding how much to invest in the training resources for those people. And so if those people are not getting good training, then they're not being very helpful on the phone lines to the customers who are calling in. And so it comes all the way down to the frontline worker and the customer ultimately. And then when you had this big fight within the family, of course, it's over leadership, right? And so, you know, Joe was kind of fired, then he was unfired, and then Tony was fired, and then Joe was fired and Tony was unfired. And so you had this kind of tumultuous period. Now, I know the company did their absolute best to just keep going through all of that because they had this Shaw deal in the works. But that could be something that's very distracting for the employees, where you're seeing this fight playing out within your own company on the front page of the Globe and Mail every day, and you're sort of wondering, what does this mean for me? And that can be a stressful experience. So I think, like, there's this scene I talk about where they have an off-site meeting at Hotel X, and it's just like a weird scene because Joe Natale's the CEO, but there's real doubt over whether he's going to remain the CEO at that point. But they had this off-site meeting that had already been planned, and so all the top-level executives are all there at this meeting. And like the scene just gets really wild if you read it. There's like, you know, people going up to the mic giving speeches about how like Joe's the best leader. And then at the same time, there's all these people who are like loyal to the CFO, to Tony, who are sitting there just shaking their heads being like, this is so cringe. Why is he doing this? So it really is kind of like a scene from Succession. If you guys watch that show, which you absolutely should. It's probably like the best TV show ever written in my opinion. But yeah, so that it really does affect all aspects of the company, and then the investors too, of course, right? Because that decision making at the top level translates to decision making all the way down the chain. Great question.
Over here. Hi, my name is Emily, and first of all, I want to say thank you so much. Like, it opened up an idea of business journalism I've never had before, so thank you for that. And my question was, what was your first story that ignited your excitement for business journalism?
Ooh. Oh man, that's a tough question. I would say I was kind of slow to fall in love with business journalism. Like when I first started writing business stories, like I kind of alluded to in my speech, like I was writing about something I didn't really understand, which was really scary, to be honest with you. I was working at the Canadian Press, so I was what's called a general assignment reporter, and we did a lot of just like earnings stories. Like you're writing about a company's earnings, and that, I have to say, at that time did not excite me. Once you're a beat reporter that really knows a specific industry, those earnings stories do actually take on meaning for you because you start to minutely follow what's happening in the company and the dynamics and the competition between their competitors in the industry, and you get little clues on the earnings call about whether things are going well or not. I mean, they'll always tell you that things are going well, but you hear the questions from the analysts and you'll get an indication that maybe things are not going as well as management would like you to think. So I did a lot of that, and I would literally be on the phone with analysts. Like I would be doing a mining story, and I'd get on a call with an analyst, and they would just start throwing terms at me, and I just didn't understand them. Like I would record the whole call. It would be like a 15-minute interview, and then it would take me an hour to go through the interview and listen back to it and Google like every other word. I'd be Googling like every other word because I'd be like, I don't know what this means. I don't know what that means. And so it was a painful process. And then gradually I started to become really interested in like specific stories, right? So I was writing a lot about real estate, and I started to be really fascinated by the housing market because of course like housing is, you know, it's such an essential human need essentially to have a roof over your head. And then meanwhile you have all these economic and market forces shaping your ability to access not just buying a home, which I know for like people your age and even people my age can be a distant dream and seems like it might never happen, but even just renting a home, right? Because if people are not able to go from renting to buying, then there's more renters in the market, and then your rent is going up. And so I was like really interested at first in the stories that most obviously and directly touch people's lives. And it took me a longer time to kind of start to appreciate the sort of finance side of things, because that feels like a step removed, right? If you're talking about investment banking and companies' ability to access capital to grow their businesses. But there's so many interesting stories there too about tech companies that are trying to start up. And, you know, honestly, Canadian tech companies that are being bought all the time by American companies because we don't have a big enough market for them to address here. Or, you know, according to some entrepreneurs, we don't have enough ambition to see ourselves as the acquirer and are always the acquiree. And so it was kind of slowly, I would say. And then I think this story, the Rogers story, was the thing that like really was this big like moment for me where I was like, yes, like telling stories like this is kind of like what I was meant to do, because it ticked all of those boxes. It's like touching people's lives, and you're dealing with power, and you're dealing with you know, critical infrastructure and people's ability to communicate with one another ultimately, which has become so essential to our lives.
Hi, my name is Danya. Thank you so much for coming today and sharing your time with us. I have 2 questions, if that's all right, quick questions. The first one is, I'm really interested in what your fact-checking process was for this story. For instance, in the excerpt that was shared with us, you begin it by saying shortly before 10 a.m. on Saturday, September 25th, 2021, like with timestamps, street names, whatever. I was wondering what the process is for fact-checking all of those things and making sure that they were accurate. It did happen shortly before 10 a.m. or after 10 a.m. or whatever. And then the second question is, what did you find was the big difference in writing articles versus now compiling it into a full book? What was the difference in the process?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Yeah, so fact-checking a book that is like over 100,000 words is like very, very, very laborious. So I did it in multiple stages. The way I try to work as a journalist is like I'm pretty OCD about trying to get all those little details right like the first time around. You're never gonna do that. Like you're always gonna have like some small thing, but I operate on the assumption of like you don't know anything, and if you assume you know something, that's when it gets you. It's like those things that you take so for granted that like, yeah, for sure I know that street name, or like for sure I know that person's name. It's those things that you kind of go on autopilot for where you'll often make the mistake. So I kind of just Google everything all the time. And in terms of things like time stamps or location, so like some of that would be in a court document. Some of that would be coming from a source that I was speaking to. If it was a source, my general policy was that I tried to have at least 2 sources verify it. It does depend on how contentious the information is. So if it's something really contentious that people are in disagreement on, and you can't get a consensus on the truth. Like there's this one story in the book about how like a certain board member had stepped down, according to some people, and then other people said, no, he never stepped down. He said he would step down later. And then the board, there was like minutes from the board meeting that were released in court, and the board minutes said he stepped down, and then there was a note that said, actually, he didn't step down, like someone had like modified the board minutes. And so it became this real like, whoa, what is reality here kind of moment. And so at times like that, the best course of action is actually just to tell that to the reader and show them like this particular fact, like the butt dial, for example, whether or not the butt dial happened, whether or not it was a butt dial or a butt answer, like it's in dispute, like who called who accidentally answered. And so it can be kind of actually fun to like break that down for the reader and be like, there is not a broad agreement on this thing. But if it's something just like color, like you would kind of not need to go as far to, you know, absolutely, like you don't need like 5 sources to be like, yes, it was before 10 a.m. Like if the person is pretty confident, or if it's in a court document or whatever, you usually can just go with that. And then there was a proofreader for the book. There was like multiple layers of edits, and one of the proofreaders, like she would go through and be like, oh, this company name actually changed its name by this date. Or like I had a friend read the book, and he's an amateur pilot, and so he was talking about like, oh, you might want to double check this anecdote about the float plane landing at night because float planes, like they generally don't land at night or whatever it was, right? So I had friends as an extra layer because there are always things that your eyes are gonna gloss over because you've now read this book 7 times that you've written and you hate it more every time you read it. And then your second question was going from reporting for the paper to reporting a book. And that was the biggest challenge for me because I am a news hound. I really like writing news and like doing it fast. Like I like to be in the moment writing news stories. And then this was like a step back thing where I had to now like reconstruct scenes and you're trying to tell a story. And so there's a lot more opportunity to weave in color. And so that was a challenge, was getting that color, right? Like you're interviewing differently even for a book. You're not just trying to get facts from people. You're going like, okay, where were you when that happened? How were you feeling? What were you wearing? What had you, what had you done right before that? What did you do right after? Like, what did that person say? Do you remember if they sounded angry? Like you're all of a sudden trying to like put the reader into the room when the thing happened. And so it's a very different style of interviewing. So I did have all these interviews and all this material I had done as part of my reporting, but I had to go back and talk to as many of those people as I could again and ask them all those other kinds of things that I hadn't asked them before.
Hi, my name is Hannah, and I have 2 questions. The first one is, as you started to research this story, I would expect that there were certain people that you maybe started to trust more or like more. How do you protect yourself from bias, and what does maybe the team aspect of this kind of reporting look like? So how did colleagues kind of speak into this story and maybe even correct you if you felt like you were going in one direction? And then my second question is, do you think you'll write another book at some point, and will it be a similar sort of genre as this?
Yeah, great questions. So on the bias front, like this was very, very front and center for me because my goal in writing this book was to not take a side. I was like, I'm not gonna take a side. This family is in disarray, and there's also, it's not just 2 sides like of the family, there's also management, like there's like past management and future management, right? There's like Team Joe and Team Tony. So there's really like 4 sides. And while Team Joe is aligned with one side of the family and Team Tony is aligned with the other side of the family, they're not perfectly aligned. Like their interests don't perfectly align because one faction is like the family that controls the whole thing and one faction is like paid management, right? Like they're kind of like the hired help essentially. And so they can't always know that their best interests are what's driving the family dispute, right? So my goal was to always be kind of in the middle and just lay out all the different sides for people and not take a side. But that being said, you do have sources on all sides of the thing who you trust more or less. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think it's a good thing because over time, when people tell you things and you are able to corroborate those facts either through documents or they tell you like this person's trying to do this thing and you're like, I don't believe you. Like at one point I had a source call me and go, Edward's just gonna fire the whole board. What do you think of that? And I was like, what? No, he's not. Can he do that? Can he just fire the board? And they're like, yeah, why can't he? He's going to do it. Just watch. And I was like, I don't believe this person. And then he did that exact thing. And so now that source has become so valuable because you're like, oh, this guy knows. Like this guy must have some kind of direct information source close to Edward. Maybe he's talking to Edward himself. Maybe it's through a couple layers, but he really knows what's going on. And so as time goes on, you're reporting a story like this, you start to know like who actually knows things. And then you start to know what their kind of vested interests are, like how they might be trying to spin you. And then you have to kind of root that out. So you develop a process where you learn to like assimilate the information that they're giving you, but strip out all of the opinion that they're adding to it. Because you can say like something happened and that's a fact, or you can say there's like a perception of something and that's like they're interpreting it through their lens. So yeah, you start to learn. And people, when their information ends up not being accurate, it's often not because they're actually lying to you, although like in this modern age of like Trump and fake news and stuff, like people do actually blatantly lie, so you have to be on guard for that. But a lot of the time, they're not intending to mislead you, they're actually like telling you something that they think is correct. and maybe their information is slightly off, or maybe their lens is so narrow that they're just seeing it a different way. Like sometimes two things can both be true at the same time if you stretch your mind enough. So there were real moments where I had to go, oh my God, have I been like tricked into believing something that isn't true? And I had to like go through and like re-examine everything just to make sure that I could sleep at night and be like, yeah, I truly believe that I've done my absolute best to verify all this information. So it's challenging. And I would complain to a colleague about this. I'd be like, man, separating fact from fiction is so hard in this story. And he would be like, Alex, that's the actual job. Like, that's journalism, that's the job. And I'm like, oh yeah, that's right. Why am I complaining about it? But yeah, and then very briefly, I will write another book, but it will not be a Canadian business book. Not because I don't think that Canadian business books are really important and valid. Unfortunately, the market for Canadian business stories is really small. And I want to be able to do something that can appeal to a greater audience. So I think my next project will be historical nonfiction.
There's a couple more questions, and while I get the mic to the next question, I wanted to say, everyone, all these students, just background for you, Alex, they've only ever done news so far. So next term, they do their intro feature writing course. So that's where they will be learning about scene setting and creating tension.
Oh, fun.
And that kind of thing. And the other thing I wanted, just if you could answer quickly, just in the realm of kind of jargon, could you explain what a quarterly earnings call is? Because I bet most people don't know.
Fair. I should have added a bit of a preface there. So if a company is publicly traded, meaning you can buy shares of it on the stock market, they have to regularly report what they're doing with that investor money to their investors and shareholders. So every quarter, meaning every 3 months, they put out like this massive, more than one document really. It's like one big document and then a bunch of other supplemental documents that break down like, here's their net income, here's their revenue, here's their expenses, here's their adjusted net income, which you can't really call it adjusted and net in my opinion, but they do. And then, here's how much each shareholder would have made on each share of profit. And then they'll have a big call, like a conference call that lasts about an hour. And the CEO will like make opening remarks, and then they'll hand it over to the CFO, who will literally read through all these numbers for you, which is so hard to pay attention to. And then at the end is the really fun part. The analysts all jump in and ask questions, and that's when you get a lot of hints of like how the financial analysts are viewing the company's performance, which can be really illustrative.
Hi, I'm Rachel. Thank you so much for coming. Also, I love your hair. Like, it's so nice. But my question was, I definitely understand the importance of calling out people in these like high places, these like super powerful people. But how do you protect yourself and also the people you interview in this process? Like, what if somebody gives you some really important information, but they're like, oh, but please, like, don't tell them who I am. Like, how do you protect yourself? And like, imagine, like, I don't want to like write something that's truthful and then maybe I won't get sued, but like I'll disappear in the middle of the night. So like, how do you protect yourself and the people you interview?
Yeah, a very, very, very good libel lawyer. I'm not joking, but that is part of the answer. So this book was definitely lawyered, which the publisher paid for mostly. I paid a small amount of the legal fees. So you definitely want your stuff lawyered so that if there's anything that you could get sued over, so that you know that there's no, like, you could still get sued, but as long as you win, right? Or they don't have like a good case, like your reputation will be safe. And some people in journalism view it as like a badge of honor to have been sued and like have the case have been thrown out or they won or whatever. Most of the time companies will try to scare you by sending like letters being like, if you publish this, we will sue you. And then most of the time they don't. And then even when they do, there's statement of claims that are filed that literally go nowhere. So a lot of we call that libel chill. It means it's like basically corporations trying to scare reporters off of doing investigative journalism. And like it is scary, right? It's really scary because your reputation is at stake. If you're like a freelancer or something, like who's going to pay for that lawsuit? Do you have some kind of like errors and omissions or libel insurance or whatever as a freelancer? If you work at a major news outlet like the Globe and Mail, you do have the protection of your editors and management and the Globe and Mail's lawyers and libel insurance and all that. And so that helps you sleep at night, especially if the work has been vetted by, and like all contentious stories would be vetted by senior management. And then in terms of protecting your sources, that's really huge. We have so many, like I could talk about that on its own for hours. But you know, the biggest thing is obviously you don't name them in the story. You don't tell anyone who you've spoken to, and people will try to find out. Like when I first broke the first big story in this whole Rogers series of scoops, which was just the fact that Tony had been fired, but actually it was Joe who was supposed to have been fired, and it was Edward who wanted him out. I had a lot of, like there was kind of like a witch hunt in the company of trying to find out like who had talked. And at one point I had talked to a source who was a very senior person in the organization who jokingly said, "What if I pull off your fingernails? Will you tell me then?" And I was like, "No, I will not tell you my source." I don't write my sources' names down in my notes. Like I use code names. So if someone did somehow get my notes, they would be like, who's platypus? Or like, who's like bulldog? Like who are these people? Who's wolf? Like I have no idea. So that's one thing you can do. You definitely don't put any information about any source's name in an email, because if you did get a lawsuit, you'd have to like hand over your emails in the discovery process. And then, you know, some of that stuff will get redacted, but you don't want to take that chance. It makes more people have access to that information, like lawyers even. You don't put anything in an email. You try not to have really sensitive conversations via text. Like I use Signal. I have some sources who will only talk to me in person. And we try to pick somewhere to meet that's like off the beaten path. Like we're not gonna meet like in Rosedale where someone could see us together. We're gonna meet in like some divey like diner somewhere. So that's a really big thing. So yeah, so it's a case-by-case basis. You're trying to figure out like how comfortable the source is. I had one source who was like really wanted to talk to me, but his wife was like, what if he loses his job by talking to you? And I had to talk to his wife on the phone and be like, I promise you I will do everything in my power to protect the source, your husband. And I told her, you know, I'm talking to over 100 people, so there's power in numbers. So it's like, and I think all those things kind of reassured her, and she eventually gave her blessing. But it is scary. Like people do have, they're taking risk to talk to you, so you don't want to be like loosey-goosey about it and just like, you know, you don't even tell sometimes your colleagues, like if you are working as part of a team, which I think that was another question that I forgot to answer, the teamwork aspect of it. Sometimes you have a source where you don't even tell the other reporters on the story who your source is, because you don't know if that reporter is going to go out for a drink with someone and part of their reporting and then casually offhand mention like, oh, Alex had a conversation with so-and-so. They might just forget. Like they're not guarding that information as closely as you are because it's not their secret, right? And so you would only have one senior editor on masthead who knows who that source is, because someone in the newsroom has to know, like the editor-in-chief or the managing editor or whoever. So yeah, a lot of stuff you can do.
How are you doing this morning?
Great, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. My name is Jonathan, and just a quick question. As a business journalist, what is one of the biggest learning curves that you had transitioning from something totally different? Because in business journalism, you have the power to affect a lot of things. Like you can affect the stock market, somebody's stock. What is like the biggest learning curve and things you have to look out for when kind of transitioning or entering that space?
I would say one of the biggest challenges, other than like all the jargon and stuff, is the fact that companies have these like PR machines, and unlike politicians where they have an actual duty to talk to the press and they want to get their message out there and they'll do scrums and they'll talk to you, companies don't have to talk to the media. They just have to talk to their investors, which they can do on that quarterly earnings call where they're literally reading a script. and all the questions from the analysts tend to be a little softball because the analysts don't want to lose access to the executives. So they tend to feel, a lot of companies tend to feel like there's more risk in it for them to talk to journalists than reward, especially if they've been burned at some point, meaning like maybe they got misquoted by someone who didn't understand their industry or whatever. And so a lot of the time you're asking for an interview and you're getting back like, and actually government does this a lot too, but you're getting back like a 2-sentence statement in an email that literally does not answer any of your questions. And so that's really hard. And just breaking through that wall of comms people who are sort of gatekeeping the executives and trying to keep them away from you. It does take patience, but eventually once people start reading your reporting and they see that you're learning and you're trying to get it and you're trying to be fair and you're not out to get them, you're actually just trying to understand and explain complex things for readers, many of them do come around and eventually talk to you. I had one colleague who covered telecom before I did, and the CEO of TELUS told her that he didn't want to talk to her until he was sure that she was a serious student of the industry. And so that is one way you can kind of win people to your side, is by showing them like you're trying to get it and you just need their help to get it better.
Another one?
Just quickly, which do you prefer, like account or access? You know how you spoke about accountability or access, and why?
It's a great question. I actually try to kind of marry both in my reporting. So like they don't necessarily have to be, like there are journalists in our newsroom who practice like very specifically access journalism. Like they're always the person getting the big CEO interview. And then there are people like on the investigative team who are only doing accountability journalism. I actually think both have merit. And I think like for a book like the one that I wrote, like I couldn't have achieved that book without having access, right? And that wasn't necessarily because I had gone around flattering people and telling them what they wanted to hear and that's why they decided to give me access. It was because quite frankly, I had already broken a bunch of news and I had a book deal and they're like, this book is happening with or without me, so I might as well tell my side of it so it doesn't end up being a very one-sided story. So I did end up getting the access. And of course, you're always like, even if you're doing accountability journalism, like you're always being professional and you're always being courteous. You're not like, you know, like coming at them like, aha, I got you on something, right? Like you're there to listen and you're not fighting with the interview subject. You're asking them tough questions, but you're giving them chance to, space to talk and to explain things. But you're also kind of making sure that there's no surprises so that when they open the paper or they open the book or whatever, they're not like, I didn't know that she was going to put that in. You're being upfront about, the facts that you have and giving them a chance to rebut them. But at the end of the day, you are holding them accountable, right? Because you're laying it all out there. So you can do both. You can practice both, elements of both. And there are stories that I will do where it is just like an interview with a leader and you are just talking about what powerful people say and not what they do necessarily. Not every story has the opportunity or gives you the time to like dig into what is actually happening behind the scenes. You pick your spots, right? You do those stories where you're like, this one really merits doing like the big feature or the big accountability piece.
We've got one more question. And while I walk the mic over, I'm just going to do a little bit of housekeeping. So this lecture and all the questions will be available within the day. I'll send out the link to you all. As you know, there's going to be a quiz related to this and the excerpt that I sent you. And I just wanted to remind you about that. You'll have a week to answer the questions on that quiz. And okay, here's the last question before we wrap and go to the reception.
Now that you've done this story, is there any other major Canadian corporations you've kept your eye out on? Or is there any other sort of Canadian businesses that you would like to do a similar story like this on?
It all kind of just depends on the news flow. So all of the like big stories that I've gotten to do, it was sort of a case of like right place, right time. So what I always try to think about is like positioning myself in a beat where I think the stories are going to be exciting and interesting. So what I've now, after publishing this book, I have actually changed roles. I'm no longer the telecom reporter. I, by amazing coincidence, ended up being the telecom reporter at the time when this fight was going down. But now I'm covering financial and cybercrime, which I think is a really hot area that's like really going to heat up. We have a lot of pressure from our neighbors to the south on Canada to sort of clean up our act with regards to things like money laundering and financial crime. And then, of course, we've got like the increasingly sophisticated cyber attacks that are taking place against individuals and businesses. And so I think that's going to have a lot of good stories in it. So I just try to find something that I'm interested in that I think is going to be really relevant to readers. And then some part of it is kind of reacting to the news, and then some part of it is kind of setting agenda and going like, what are the big stories that nobody's telling in this space? So this role is a little bit less company specific and a bit broader. So I get to touch on a lot of different companies, the banks, of course, being one of them. Thanks, guys.
On behalf of the school, Alexandra, thank you so much for your time and your attention, and certainly for sharing your experiences. I appreciate the questions that you have, that they've come from a variety of places speaking about the topic that she's describing, but also asking in a very curious way, what can I learn about my own work or how I can approach my work from learning through your lessons. One of the things I'm very happy to hear is about the success of your book, and on some levels disappointed to hear that a future book about the business of Canadian media isn't necessarily going to be lucrative, which is part of the reason that being in the infrastructure of Canadian media is such a powerful thing. Because you all probably spend a lot of time, and you invoke the name of Elon Musk to say, we know a lot about other people, and we don't know a lot about ourselves. So being able to shed that light on something that touches our collective lives every day is incredibly important, and a remarkable gift that you can give to everybody else in the country, as well as a student of journalism, in the way that Alex has done. So thank you very much for being here. And if you're available for the reception, there is a reception afterwards that's in or adjacent to the Ven, and you're welcome to join. It goes from about now until about 1. Thank you so much.
Thank you.